This is the Graceful Atheist Podcast. Welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast. My name is David, and I am trying to be the Graceful Atheist. Please consider rating and reviewing the podcast on podchaser.com or the Apple Podcast Store, and subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening. Special thanks to Mike T for editing today's podcast. I want to highlight again the good work of many of the people who have previously been on the podcast. I want to mention Troy Moore-Hart's hashtag Religion Shouldn't Hurt. Go check out that work on Instagram and various other social media. And then I have a quick message from Janice Selby, who is the director of the Conference on Religious Trauma, CORT. This conference was going to happen in 2020, and then because of the pandemic had to shut down. But Janice is now going to do it in 2021 as an online conference. Here she is to tell us a little bit about the Conference on Religious Trauma. Janice, I want to give you an opportunity to tell us about the Conference on Religious Trauma that is coming up in May.
Oh, thank you. I'm very excited about it. It's actually taking place online, May 11th to 16th. And we have, I think, about 21 speakers that will be joining us throughout the conference. And many of them are mental health experts who can speak knowledgeably on this topic and religious recovery. And the other ones are just fantastic people who have managed to overcome religious trauma in their own lives. And the backgrounds are varied. We have ex-Muslims, ex-Orthodox Jews, ex-Christians, ex-Mormons, ex-Moonies, you name it, we've got it, because everybody who's been part of fundamentalist religious groups has suffered trauma at some point as a result of being in those groups, and then again for leaving the group.
And you've got a number of experts as well. Dr. Marlene Weinell of Leaving the Fold fame. You've got Dr. Daryl Ray. You've got Alan Ross, who's a cult expert. Who are you looking forward to?
Yes, I've never heard Rick Alan Ross before, so I'm really excited about him. Of course, I'm a huge fan of Dr. Weinell and Dr. Ray. Excited also to hear Yasmin Mohammed, and her book is Unveiled, and I know that she is just a powerhouse. She's done lots and lots of interviews, and I'm looking forward to her as well. And Nathan Phelps, the son of a Westboro Baptist minister. So yeah, there are just so many interesting people coming from so many different angles about this.
Now, I understand the new URL, it doesn't roll off the tongue, but how can people find it? Is there a special Google search you can do to find it the quickest?
They can try Googling Conference on Religious Trauma. They can also reach out to me at CORT, that's Court Information, at gmail.com, courtinformation@gmail.com, and I will be happy to point the way to the website for that.
Fantastic. The URL for CORT is a tough one, but it is feedloop.com/court/site/home, but definitely that will be in the show notes. Keep an ear out for a bonus episode that will come up with a more extended conversation with Janice Selby as she tells us more about the Conference on Religious Trauma. On to today's show. My guest today is Sarah. Sarah works in the mental health profession, and she spent a lot of time outside of the United States as she was growing up and going through college. When she came back to the United States, she was shocked at the Christian nationalism, the focus on complementarianism. She was always uncomfortable at the role of women in the church. And because she's an incredibly bright, intelligent person who is focused on science, that just wouldn't be contained. Post-Deconstruction, Rachel Held Evans had a tremendous impact on her, and the quote that Sarah points out several times is, "On the days that I believe," and Sarah acknowledges that she still wants to believe, but has deconstructed. But this side of that deconstruction, she is interested in where we can connect with one another. Where are our deconstructing friends in real life? It's easy to find each other online. It is much, much harder to be in the room with each other. And how do we find one another? I think you will find Sarah as intriguing as I did. Here's my conversation with Sarah. Sarah, welcome to the Graceful Atheist Podcast.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Sarah, I wanted to thank you for reaching out to me. You were one of the people who wrote me just this amazing email describing your story, and I knew for sure that I wanted to have you on. You say that you might have the longest deconstruction story of anyone.
It feels like that.
Yeah. Really interested to hear what you have to say. So tell me about your faith tradition and what kind of Christian were you?
Sure. So I do want to start with, I've heard so many deconstruction stories. There may be one that is longer than mine, but I haven't heard it yet. If there is, I'm really looking forward to hearing it. So I grew up when I was really young. Was attending a very small fundamentalist Baptist church in a city where there were not actually a lot of evangelicals. It's a very nominal Catholic area. So my church had tons of rules that made me feel very different from those around me. Like our rules were like no rock music, no dancing, no drinking, all really, really restrictive things. And because the church was really small, I didn't have very many friends there. And we were only supposed to hang out with Christians. So that kind of left you with really not a lot of options. So as a young child, completely surrounded in this religious culture in this very small place, I would be constantly praying that a new Christian family would move in on my street and I would get a friend.
Right.
They never did. And I never really fit in. I never felt like I fit in that well with a small group of girls at the church. Women were really limited in roles along with all the other fundamentalist stuff. And I went along with it because I thought you had to. But
Mm.
from the way I saw it, most of them, women and girls in the church, seemed happier about going along with those roles. At least that's how I perceived it. And so I remember my early days of being kind of lonely in my faith tradition. Like I didn't have a great community around me that made it feel so amazing for me personally. Maybe it was for other people. And the church we went to was really small and it struggled to survive. And I was all into inviting friends to church and trying to do all that. But there were so many things that set me apart from my school friends who didn't go to church, like things that sound small but were big at the time, like not being able to get my ears pierced, or later on not being able to go to junior high school dances. And I was also really pushed to kind of wear skirts all the time when girls were like wearing jeans. And unfortunately, I think I passed along a lot of my judgmental messages that I heard in church to people around me. So that wasn't great for connecting with people.
I think you're telling many people's story there, though. I think that happens a lot.
Yeah. So it wasn't all bad. But I certainly look back and go, oh man, I wish, you always know so much more in hindsight.
Yes.
There was also a lot of drama at our little church. There's people who left because they wanted to remarry and they weren't allowed, and pastors were asked to leave over theological issues. And my mom actually got in trouble for volunteering at the traveling Billy Graham crusade because even Billy Graham was not good enough for our church.
Okay.
So that's how right they all were. And speaking of my mom, I don't want to talk a lot about other people, but my mom was kind of interesting in terms of her effect on me because she was the biggest church attender in our family. My dad got more annoyed with the church and all their drama, but my mom was really dialed into it, and she was more of a natural leader.
Mm-hmm.
So she was the Sunday school superintendent until they decided that a man should do that job, and there was a man willing to do it.
Oh,
and
no.
she was okay with that because she kind of deferred to that.
Yeah.
So my mom kind of went along with these women limited roles. But yet, on the other hand, she kind of encouraged me to be anything I wanted to be. Like when little kids want to do everything. If I wanted to be a doctor or lead the country in a political role, she was all for that. So I got some really interesting mixed messages.
Well, but hey, it's good that you had that, at least that bit, right?
I'm super grateful for that. And I have, it's interesting to look back on the parent point. I don't want to talk about a lot of people, but my parents are pretty supportive people all the way through.
Okay.
So I was a pretty smart kid and I was put in like advanced classes and I really started to enjoy science. Of course, I didn't know, when I look back at my story, I'm like, that was kind of the beginning of something because I didn't realize how much science would play into my later deconstruction. But I remember in junior high loving science class.
Yeah.
I also remember even when I was really young, getting caught up on the concept of following the will of God.
Ah, okay.
It really threw me for a loop. Because when I tried to follow it, I would get really into the amount of micromanagement, and it became overwhelming. Like when I started to take, okay, where God wants you to go, and then step back from that of paying attention to things, you would go in that area. It got back into such minor things. Like, people would say, oh, it was God's will that we met today. I'm thinking, well, if it's God's will that you run into someone that day, like, should I be walking faster or slower to run into that person?
Exactly.
And that's just a kind of example. So I got really like, I didn't even know how to make sense of that anymore. So, but this is also the 1980s. There's no word for deconstruction that I knew of. If anything, the word was doubt, or you're doubting, or maybe even worse connotation, you're backsliding. So even when I was really young, I knew I was at least a doubter. And that didn't have a great term to it. And I was likely a backslider too. So,
You were honest, very young, yes.
yeah, that part's interesting. So when I was a teenager, I moved to a much bigger city.
Mm-hmm.
And we started to go to a slightly less conservative church, and they didn't get so upset about dancing, which was like, oh, thank goodness. And I met a lot more Christian friends, and I had a group of friends who went to my high school and were in my youth group. So from a social perspective, things were much better.
Okay.
There's still a lot of rules about women in church, but our new church had a woman in an internship role, and that seemed pretty progressive from where I was coming from.
Okay.
Not really, but in that moment. I also made a lot of new non-Christian friends. It turns out that when you're not telling them that God wouldn't be happy about them wearing earrings, you can make a lot more friends. So.
Yes.
So, and to my surprise, like having made so many more new non-Christian friends, it was surprising how together they had it. They were smart and nice, and their families were nice.
Yeah.
And they were hardly the sinful, moralless, lost souls the church had kind of told me they would be back in my other city.
Yeah.
So I started to become more of a normal teen and do more normal teen stuff. And, some of that was good, some of it wasn't good. But my youth group friends and I were all kind of in the same boat. We were all kind of doing the same stuff. So it got a little bit easier from a social perspective.
Yeah. I was just going to say, I went to a Christian college that was very conservative, and I was shocked at the behavior of some of the people that went there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm not going to throw anyone in the bus here.
Yeah, exactly.
So as I started to learn more about science, this was a big hang up for me for a while. A lot of things I learned did not go well with the 10,000-year-old literal interpretation of Genesis.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I got hung up on that for a long time.
I can imagine, yes.
At first, I really defended it. And I was the one who got creation movies to show in my public high school science class.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right.
And I'm sighing now because I really need to contact that teacher and thank him for his kindness to me, because those movies were horrible.
Yeah.
Anyway, but I loved science, and I took all the science classes you could in high school. And then I actually did science in university, and I did biology. And if you're struggling about the origins of the earth and evolution and all that, gosh, let's just throw yourself right into biology.
Yeah, but biology is not the place you want to be. Yes.
So even going to university was really interesting for me, because I still had that issue with the will of God, and I prayed so hard I would go to the right school. I remember that vividly, even though it was like decades ago.
Yeah.
And I felt like I got 0 messages back about where I should go. And I thought, if God's going to show up, he should really show up now. And I didn't feel like he did. And it was really frustrating for me. So I picked my university on my own. It was a school that had a great science reputation. It was fully secular, but it started as a Baptist college like 100 years before. So I kind of still kept it on the good side.
That's close enough. Yeah. Hey, can I interrupt just for a split second? I want to talk about the attempting to live within the will of God. I think this is one of the most destructive ideas in the church. And I love the way you described it. It's like, should I have been walking faster or slower? Right? Like if you really take that seriously, you can it's analysis paralysis. You can not be able to live your life. And then the other thing that you mentioned, when you really prayed deeply for God to speak into your life, to tell you where to go to college, and then that silence, what do you do with that?
It was very frustrating, and I interpret it differently now than I did then, but it was painful at that time, because it wasn't the way I was told it would be. And I thought what school I went to was important. And if God really was interested in what was happening in my life, that he would help me out with it. I got to university and I was free of the oversight of my parents. And I took a lot of advantage of this.
Okay.
In the beginning, I felt kind of guilty about all the fun I was having, and also for not going to the Christian student groups on campus. But then something really sad happened. There was a huge motor automobile accident with that group.
Oh, wow. All right.
Several members of the group were killed.
Wow.
Including the paid leader of the group, so the person who was the leader for it, and that person's wife was pregnant with their first child. And it was tragic.
Oh, no. Wow.
And a girl from my dorm was paralyzed for life, so she had to leave school. She did return, I think, the next year, but in a wheelchair. So it was jarring to think that if I had attended that group, I might have easily gone on that event and been injured or killed.
Wow.
And it was not very motivating to ever want to attend. It was interesting too, because one of my high school youth group friends also lived in my dorm. I lived in a co-ed dorm. He lived on the first floor and I was on the third floor. And we only went to church once that year in our first year. And I think it was the Sunday after this accident, because I think that was just kind of hard for us to process. Neither one of us had been darkened the doorstep of this group, and I never did.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I mean, that would be earth shattering. And especially if you're asking yourself, God was supposed to be protecting those people. Why didn't he?
Yeah. And I felt bad that I wasn't going. And then I didn't feel bad I wasn't going at all.
Yeah.
So,
yes. It's a perfectly normal response. Yes.
And it was really close to me because this person on my floor was one of my friends and her life changed dramatically. And she was a lovely person too. Anyway, life turned out pretty good for her despite her injury. But yeah, life got really hard.
Yeah.
So during these times, I started to really wonder about a lot of things. Creation versus evolution was a huge thing for such a long time. I really wanted to believe in creationism, but it just didn't stand up to what I was learning.
Yeah.
And at first I thought I just didn't know enough about creationism. So I tried to learn more. And the stuff that I tried to find out about, it was just not good science.
Right. Right. Yes.
So, I remember, it's funny that you remember these vivid things. I remember once looking at chlorophylls under a microscope in a plant biology class and understanding how their role they played in evolution, or the role they thought they played. And I remember thinking, I get this. I understand why they say this played a role in evolution. This really makes sense. And I remember that moment so vividly. There also was a creation versus evolution debate on campus. And I was like, oh, great. This is going to be awesome. I'm going to get lots of, I'm going to be like on board. I'm going to, like, the creationist is going to come through. I'm going to walk out. It's going to be so good. And I went there and it was so bad for the creationist. I just walked out going, the person arguing for the evolution points was so much better.
Yeah.
So this was a huge deal. I was a biology student and I was so hung up on this. And because I didn't know any other way to interpret the Bible except in the most literal ways.
Yeah.
And I couldn't take on the idea of evolution without a cascade of lots of problems.
Right, right. Yes, there are many theological issues with theistic evolution, but yes.
Yeah. So it was hard. But I'm in a new world now too. I had shed my crazy Christian image that I grew up with.
Okay.
I had lots of friends. I got invited to lots of events. Life was pretty good. One area that was pretty confusing was dating.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I still felt really strongly like I had to marry a Christian.
Interesting. All right.
But there weren't a lot of Christian options. So I dated, different people. The people I dated the longest weren't Christians, but I knew I could never marry them, or that's the idea I had.
Uh-huh.
And the Christians I would date, I would never date them for very long. And I would be usually the one who would kind of call it off.
You would call it off. Yeah. Okay.
In hindsight, I think I had to stay pretty closed off to them because by this point I had so many questions about Christianity. I was basically playing Christian around Christians.
Right.
And
okay.
So if I dated a Christian, I had to pretend that I didn't have all these doubts and thoughts. And it's hard to get close to someone when you're kind of playing someone who you are. And I think they, I just felt like they didn't know who I was.
Yeah.
And if they did, they wouldn't accept it.
Right.
So that was confusing.
It's interesting, I've talked to so many people where when they grew up in the 90s in that kiss dating goodbye, so it sounds like you're a little bit sooner than that, and still you have some fairly rigid ideas about what the proper way to date is. Was that just a part of your tradition growing up, or was that something you put on yourself?
First of all, I'm really glad that I got through all this stuff and was married before the really I Kiss Dating Goodbye thing came out big time. I'm
Exactly.
so grateful for that. I think Growing Kids God's Way was the parenting version of it that I stumbled upon later on, but that's another story. So my biggest thing is I had to marry a Christian. You could not be unequally yoked.
There you go. Okay. Yes.
So it wasn't as much about, I mean, certainly there was a push for purity, but it wasn't spoken about in the same ways.
Okay.
And beyond just feeling like I had to marry a Christian because you couldn't be unequally yoked, I felt like my family was so different from so many people that if someone didn't have a grasp on Christianity, it wasn't just not going to be a good fit.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Bringing them home to the family would be awkward. Yeah.
Yeah. And I saw that because I dated some non-Christians and they just did not get my family very well. So,
okay.
Yeah. Anyway, but we'll get on to that. We'll revisit that in a minute. But one of the things that was really interesting when I was in college is I worked at a Christian summer camp one year, and you had to sign this really detailed statement of faith. So I planned to work there the second summer, and I took out the statement of faith and realized I can't sign this.
Yeah.
So I told the camp I couldn't sign it, and I couldn't work there. And that was a huge step, just to say, you know what, I'm having enough doubts that I just can't pretend this is all fine, and I'm not going to do it.
Yeah. Good for you. I tell a story of when I graduated from college to get licensed as a pastor in my denomination. The college experience was pretty good. It was pretty decent. But it was literally sign on the dotted line. You believe these, 20 things or what have you. And I signed it, and to this day, I feel guilty about signing it because it was wrong. That wasn't honest.
Yeah. And I didn't feel like I could only sign it. We're still in the 1980s right now. So this is a long time ago. I'm really on my own with these doubts. There's not a lot of resources for me. I was trying to be somewhat honest with them, and this was a big step for me, to be really honest. The camp still let me come without signing, provided I attended a special weekly Bible study just for me.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. It was me, a camp leader, and another camp leader who also struggled with some doubts. Probably not as many as me, but enough that I could have some conversations.
Yeah.
Anyway, so, and in that time, I kind of got this sense that it was that doubting was a semi-okay term for question your faith. And doubters could be okay as long as they stayed on God's side.
Right. Yes. There's some invisible line that you can't cross.
Yeah. So I talked a lot about creation and evolution in my own little Bible study. And there was a professor at my university who was known to be a very strong conservative Christian, and he was a chemistry professor. And I was like, but he was my first year chemistry professor, and I thought it was a huge class. So I didn't really know him, but we got talking about him. So the camp sent me hours down to go make an appointment. I got a day off work. I got to drive down and talk to the prof one day. And you should go talk to him. So
yeah,
I set up an appointment and went and met with this prof, which is actually really worthwhile. So if anything came out of that, my own individual scheduled Bible study, it was that.
Okay.
So I sat down with this professor and talked about creation and evolution, and he was so not hung up on creation and evolution. He didn't even care if it was creation or evolution. And I was like, oh, wow. And this is what I'm calling my first done moment.
Okay.
I talked to him, and I'm like, oh, I don't need to decide if it's creation or evolution. I can just it doesn't matter. I was like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
So amazing. But then what was funny is he goes, I'm much more concerned about these bigger problems in the Old Testament. I'm like, what? The bigger problems in the Old Testament?
Yeah. Oh, wow.
That was the beginning of my bigger problems in the Old Testament. But creation and evolution, I was like, oh, whatever. And I really, really did let a lot of it go and just say, it doesn't matter. I don't need to argue one side or the other. I don't need to be on a side.
Right.
So anyway, that was good. And so I also had this Bible study thing. I think the bad side of the Bible study, there's a lot of trying to expose what I was doing wrong that might be keeping me from God, which was
yeah.
really shaming and not yucky.
Yeah.
And yucky, I should say, not yucky. It was yucky. Just to bring it up to present day, in the last couple of years, I spoke with a person who I met with during that time, and he apologized for that. So,
oh wow, okay,
yeah, so that was kind of good. There's not a lot of bad people in my story, at least by the time you get to the end, anyway. But I really, again, that summer, really prayed for God to show Himself to me. Really, really prayed, and I got nothing. It was horrible, and I felt kind of lost. Like, I thought, why is everybody else like able to connect with God and I can't? It's really hard. And that loneliness from my childhood, feeling like I'm different than everybody else, really started to become more thematic with this issue.
Well, and there's another layer on top of that loneliness in that you're being told you should have this relationship with God, but there's no other side to that relationship, and so you feel lonely because of that as well.
Yeah. So I'm still going to church a little.
Okay.
Like with my family and stuff like that. And I still really think I have to marry a Christian, even though now I'm only dating non-Christians. So.
Scandalous. Okay.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah.
So this is a part of my life where actually things turn, and this is probably the most fortunate part of my life.
Okay.
One of my old middle school friends from the small city I used to live in comes back into my life, a guy. He was a Christian guy, but not so much like hardcore Christian guy at that time. And we had always gotten along great. He was fun and funny, and we had the best times together. From when I first met him, we were always friends.
Yeah.
And I'll tell a little magical story. The first time I held his hand, I knew I was going to marry him. And we fell madly in love.
Yes.
And I was really honest about who I was with him. And I'm going to say, spoiler alert, there's no setup. He's the real deal.
Yeah.
We've been married for a long time. And, we've been together dating and married for over 30 years. So
that's awesome. Yeah.
Like there's no bad side to this. It's not going anywhere bad with that. So I was really fortunate because I met someone who I could really be who I was with, be honest, and
authentically yourself.
Exactly. Yeah. It was good. And it's still good. So one really significant thing that happened in all of this is we once went to visit his parents. They were traveling, and we stayed with another family friend. And I was like shuffled off to stay in this room because we were out of town. And this room was one of this family's child's room. This family's a very conservative family. My husband came from an extremely conservative family too. And there was a book in the room about the women's role in the church. It was 4 essays, basically giving biblically backed arguments for what roles women were allowed to have in the church.
Oh no. Okay.
And it went from like no rules at all, like you basically sit and be quiet, to they can do everything and they could be pastor and lead the church. And then there was 2 in between. And then each article had a rebuttal from the other authors. So 4 articles, each article had 3 rebuttals. It was fascinating, very biblically oriented, like all verses. I stayed up for like hours reading this book from cover to cover. I'd never seen an argument that women could be more than the limited roles that I'd grown up with.
Ah, okay. So this was a positive thing then.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
I was completely fascinated by it.
Yeah.
And then left the book there. Wished I could have just taken it with me.
Yeah.
I could never find it again.
Yeah.
This is still like, we're still pre-internet, so it's no Amazon. I can just go order it. Like searching bookstores for it.
Yeah.
It just didn't happen. So, that was a real moment for me. I'm like, I don't have to believe, like, you don't have to believe that women are limited. That there's people who have good arguments that women aren't limited, and they're still Christians. And I was like, wow.
Almost like women are full human beings.
Oh my gosh, yes. So, and I will tell you another story. I just, since I reached out to you, reached out to the person whose room I was in, who never knew this story.
Okay.
Until this past couple of weeks, I reached out to him, and he was totally shocked.
Yeah.
I read this book.
That's funny.
So, yeah. So anyway, my now husband and I, we dated for a few years, and we had some ups and downs, but we got married, and like I said, he's the best decision of my life. I believe that strongly today. Not the best decision was having my church youth pastor do our wedding ceremony.
Okay. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. He was talking about the roles of women and men and husband and
Oh,
wives and
man.
wives submitting in front of the whole church.
Yeah.
I was completely embarrassed that I let this man speak at my wedding.
Yeah.
The funny thing is, the video of the ceremony was not recording at the very beginning, and I was told that I'd lost the sound in the video, and I'm like, good, I never want to hear that again.
Don't want to relive that one. Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I had friends coming up to me. I had a lot of friends, and I had friends coming up to me afterwards, my non-Christian friends going, Sandra, I didn't know you were so religious.
Yeah.
It was so embarrassing. It's just one of my regrets in life. So as soon as we got married, though, we moved, and I went back to graduate school, and I actually moved to the United States. So I haven't been living in the United States yet.
Okay.
Because that was the only one that offered the program I wanted. I was terrified. I thought, oh my gosh, I'm just going to have to I really want this degree. I'm just going to have to hold it together and get this degree. And I'm just going to have to not be my authentic self. And I was pretty good at playing Christian by then and pretending I didn't have doubts. What was super surprising, it was a Quaker school. And there was a surprising liberal component.
Okay.
Which was really amazing and freeing.
Yeah.
And it warmed me back to church again, because there was a really big social justice component, and women, there was certainly lots of roles for women, every role for women within a certain element of the school. The school wasn't homogeneous in its thinking, which again was helpful. So, and my husband was still pretty conservative. So, we were moving to a new place. So we're looking for a church and stuff. And I kind of put the line in the sand. Okay, we'll go to a church, but they have to allow women in leadership.
Yeah.
That takes out a lot of churches.
That's true. That narrows the field.
So I kind of drew this line in the sand. But another interesting thing that happened around this point is, again, I'm just new to the United States. And it's the first time I encounter Christian nationalism.
Okay.
I had never seen that before, and we were visiting a large suburban mega church.
Okay.
And Peter Marshall spoke. His mom wrote Christie, and his dad was a chaplain in the U.S. Senate.
Okay.
And he gave this long talk about the United States and God, and he spoke about how God intervened in the War of Independence, so that because the U.S. was God's chosen new land, like Israel. And I was going, what?
Yeah. Yeah. I didn't read that in the Bible. I don't know where that came from.
My gosh. So he wove a thread about abortion all through this too, which didn't even link to it, but it was felt kind of psychologically manipulative. I saw it all through this. And then he got this whole thing about how the United States was the only country in the world where you could do this and that and this and that. And I'm looking at my husband going, I've been to other places where you can do that.
Right.
What's he talking about?
Yeah.
So we were kind of confused. And at the end, this huge church gave him a massive standing ovation.
Yeah.
And my husband and I sat there confused, not standing, and a little bit scared.
Yeah.
So that memory is very interesting in relation to what's happened over the last few years in the United States. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can imagine a shocking moment of not recognition, but for the first time hearing something like that would be devastating.
And confusing. It was so confusing. We actually talked to several people about it to try to understand it. And I remember there was someone we knew who was involved with campus ministries, who was kind of more liberal in thinking, and he called it, oh, you heard American folk Christianity. I'm like, okay. Anyway. So we're looking for churches, and we're attending lots of young married classes, because that's what you do when you're young married. You go to church, you go check out the young married class. And we still laugh about young married classes.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Oh my gosh. Because we visited so many churches. So what was funny is the same thing kept happening over and over again. We'd be in these young married classes, and it would always come down to this one question. When a couple disagrees, who gets the last say?
Right. Yeah.
And we're like, oh, this is crazy. And my husband and I had decided to be egalitarian, which was pretty progressive at the time. But there was a prof at my graduate school who's really into egalitarian stuff. And then my school was really, and there was a supportive element at my school. And I was introduced to Christians for Biblical Equality. Mm-hmm. Have you heard of that organization, CBE?
No, not off the top of my head, no.
Well, I tell you, in the 90s, they were like a dream come true.
Okay.
All that stuff I couldn't find in the book,
Right.
they had out there, and they produced paper newsletters, because we're still talking really no internet at
Right.
this point. So
Yeah.
so we were the unicorns of the young marrieds, the egalitarian ones, even in the churches that allowed women in leadership roles. But we were pretty involved. We ended up being in a young married small group. We helped lead one. I found out later that our egalitarian stance scared a lot of people.
Oh, wow. Okay.
I will also tell you that most of them are now divorced.
Right.
So-
Exactly. Yeah, imagine why.
So, yeah, it's funny. My husband and I look back at that and I'm going, there's not very, I don't know if any of them are still married. Anyway, there was some, I don't want to be there. I met some very wonderful people, and
Sure.
I'm still friends with some of those people too. So, but it's in our friendship over the years that they're able to tell me how they experienced me back then. So I'm grateful for that.
Yeah.
So whenever I was in a Bible study, there'd be a few people who would like what I'd have to say, and there'd be other people that I know I scared.
Yeah.
Because by this point, I'm pretty honest about my doubts. Once you get to know me, if you're a Christian, I'm not going to play any games, and I'm going to let you know that I have a lot of questions.
Yeah.
And like I said, this is time stamping things. The internet was just beginning then. So I was still really on my own and with my doubts. The biggest thing I had was mailed Christians for Biblical Equality newsletters.
Okay. Yeah.
And then life got really busy. Young kids, moving, looking for churches in new cities, moving again.
Yeah. Repeat, rinse, repeat.
Those years, I mean, I think when you have young kids, they're just all kind of blurry. So I don't have a lot much to say about them, except we moved a lot. We looked for churches a lot.
Can I jump in here too? I think that is always an interesting time for, if a person has any doubts at all, even if they're unconscious, that process of, okay, I need to find a new church for whatever reason. And then you're kind of church shopping. You're going from one to the other, and it's like, that one's not quite right, and this one's not quite right, and I don't like that. That has quite an impact, right? Like, you start realizing, A, there's a tremendous amount of diversity out there, and B, that you have a particular sense of what is correct, and that's not what you're finding.
Yeah, there's nothing that really works.
Yeah.
So you kind of like get in a place like, what's going to work the best, which we did a lot of. So, yeah, and I found at that point, I had that good experience in my graduate school, which was unexpected. And the focus on social justice gave me something to hang on to. So I clung a lot to the Jesus was a good guy part, and that kept me, kind of hanging on to things.
I call that my grace-colored glasses, that I had the grace-colored glasses on for a long time.
Yeah. So, and there were a lot of books at that time that started to pull my thinking a little bit. I mean, the early ones were pretty connected to Christianity, like the Philip Yancey books and McLaren. And then we went to one church where the pastor was really into the emergent church stuff, and I thought that was pretty interesting. But they seemed to really only exist on the internet and not in real life.
Right. Right. You're telling my story, Sarah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
So I was really fascinated by emergent church, and
Yeah.
My last new, I mean, we've been where we are for a while. I actually found one and tried to visit it, and it was like 6 people, and not really anything substantial.
I really have a strong memory of a friend of mine from youth group and college group age in our adulthood meeting and kind of whispering to one another about the emergent church. And like, we had progressed, our faith had changed, and we were trying to navigate that new reality between the two of us. And like you say, it just didn't seem to exist in the real world around me.
Yeah. It was interesting because I learned about the emergent church through a pastor at a church we were going to, another small church we were going to, which was more conservative than the pastor. And I look back now and like, that pastor, he was trying to go to a new place, but his congregation was not on board. But it was interesting to have those conversations with them. Yeah, so I have these years where I was just kind of existing, and I don't remember as much about them. But sometime in the last And again, huge doubter, like anyone. I'll tell anyone that I'm doubting. Like I'm not pretending. I'm trying not to pretend I'm someone else. But things really started to become available on the internet. It wasn't just books anymore. I stumbled into, I call it the rabbit hole. You know, Rachel Held Evans was first. They kind of led me into Pete Enns and Mike McHargue, his Science Mike. Rachel Held Evans' book, what was her book? Searching for Sunday. So she grew up in a really different environment than me, and certainly much more Christian-focused environment. The way she thought about things, it was like she was reading my mind. It was so affirming to read that.
Yeah.
Because I'd been so lonely in so many of my thoughts. But she wasn't someone that I knew. She was just an author and a speaker, and you know, it wasn't like I could connect with her. But like then there was Pete Enns and Mike McHargue, Science Mike. They're all their talk. They're like a dream come true of books and podcasts for fellow doubters. And then I learned, oh, it's not doubting. It's called deconstruction. I was like, wow, it's a new word for it. I was like, oh, this was really impactful for me. And there's moments that were so helpful about their work.
Yeah.
By this point, for example, I was fully affirming on LGBTQ issues, but I struggled to communicate that in Christian settings, much like a lot of the issues that I struggled with, like how do you get over these Christian barriers? And at that time, it was a big deal in my area because the Episcopal Church was just splitting, and I don't know if you remember that, the Episcopal Church spun off, and the Anglican Church was the non-affirming part. So there was a new Anglican super cool church, but non-affirming, that started in our area and was really popular. I just didn't want anything to do with it because of their stand on LGBTQ issues.
Yeah.
But Science Mike, are you familiar with him, Mike?
Yes.
McHargue?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Do you know him?
No, not personally. No.
Okay, because there's this crowd of people that all know each other, so it's funny.
No. I'm a very small fish in a very large pond. So Mike is one of the big fish, very large voices. Yeah.
Big fish in that pond.
That's right. Yes.
So one of the things I love that he said, any belief you have within Christianity can make you a heretic to another arm of Christianity.
Yes.
Like any belief. And, I'd seen that through the years. So it was really true to me. So his thought on it, if you're going to be a heretic no matter what, then you might as well love people, because it's better to love people and be a heretic than be a heretic and not love people.
Yeah. Yes.
So that was another like done moment for me. Like there's my argument. I'm done. I got it. Like I love the moments where things just got, oh, this is troubling me so much. Done.
Clarity. Yeah.
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 And then again, I mentioned Searching for Sunday. That was such an amazing book. And Rachel Evans was just so wise and so honest about her struggles.
Yeah. I unfortunately missed her. So just after my deconversion, I don't know, a year or so later is when we lost her. And so I feel like I have a hole where I need to go back and read some more of her work.
Oh gosh. Yeah. She was lovely person.
Yeah.
Hanging out just from afar. Oh, I went to one more LBGT thing. Story. After I've solved this, I'm like, I'm good with this. I'm just going to be totally honest. Like I'm actually not just going to be an ally to people who are LGBTQ. And I had this down pat way of describing why I was, even to Christians.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I used to listen to all kinds of podcasts, and I was visiting with my parents, and my dad is in his 80s, and we were going to the store together. And there was a podcast on, and there was something about Christianity and issues around this. And my dad asked me what I thought of gay people. And I'm like, oh my gosh, here I am, like got it down pat. What am I going to say to my dad right now?
Yeah.
And I said, Dad, I'm fine with it.
Yeah.
And I'm totally fine with it. And my dad says, I am too. People should be able to love whoever they want. I just about died that my dad said that in a good way. I was like, oh my gosh, my dad's here now too. And it was this moment that I would just never forget.
That's pretty cool. That's awesome. Good for your dad.
Yeah. So they had some things to push them along. We have some members of our family who, same-sex couples and things. So
yeah, that'll do it. I think the big difference for many people is, when you know someone personally, it's very hard to hate that group, right? If you actually, especially if it's a loved one, but even just a friend, has just it's hard to be hateful when you're friends with somebody who happens to have a different sexual orientation.
Yeah, I agree. It's hard to vilify them, though it still can happen.
Yeah, well, that's true. Yeah.
But it's harder, definitely harder. So that was a great moment for me.
Excellent.
So I've got Facebook pages now, Facebook groups, I've got books. I still like, where are all the good, now not doubters, but all the good deconstructors around me? I'm like still like looking for friends who understand my deconstruction around me. They're all over the internet,
Yeah.
but they're not around me. And I'm like in groups, like looking, people are forming like geography pods within the Facebook groups. And like, there's none around me. I'm like, wow, I'm just meant to be alone. It's really
Yeah.
frustrating from that point of view. It's just this kind of like, makes it, for me, it's such a visual. There's a Rachel Howell Evans in that group, and Mike McCartney had a conference called Evolving Faith. And the first one they had in North Carolina, it wasn't very far away from me. So I bought 2 tickets. I was going to go, and I can't remember who was going to go with me first. It was my husband or somebody else. Anyway, it turns out no one could go. So I had 2 tickets. I'm like, I'm going to go. So I went by myself. I think I was the only person at that entire conference who attended by myself. And fortunately, I'm a confident enough person that I can walk into a crowd of thousands of people by myself and find my own place. I think I've moved around enough that I had to learn how to do that. So that part, it wasn't like super horrible that way. It was more interesting to be in this setting where a lot of people are experiencing that sense of loneliness about their faith beliefs. But I tried pretty hard to like reach out and talk to people, and it was just like, got nothing. I was like, wow.
Interesting. Okay.
Man, it wasn't super friendly. It wasn't super negative, but it was just, the speakers and everything were fabulous, and I really enjoyed that. But it kind of just drilled in that feeling of loneliness in the way I thought, because even I can go to a huge group of people who are here talking about the same thing, and I still can't find people to connect with.
Wow. Yeah, that's too bad. I was expecting you to say the opposite. So yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah, so I've always struggled with that, and I don't know why I can't find those people around me. And then even when I'm surrounded by them, I couldn't find them. But anyway, I still enjoyed the Golden Faith Conference. It was quite lovely and really helpful in a lot of ways. So that was a few years ago. I'm trying to remember what year that was. I'm trying to remember if it was pre or post. It must have been post Donald Trump. But Donald Trump changed a lot of things in the Christian world.
Yeah. Yes, he did.
And I watched a lot of people fall away from faith, mostly online. But all of a sudden there was a lot more talk about it. And a lot of new elements that I hadn't fully processed before. For example, Christianity's connection to white supremacy.
And the nationalism that you were discussing earlier.
Nationalism, yeah. And I really circled back to that nationalism. I'm like, I remember experiencing this when I first moved to this country. So now I'm kind of like, it's been a lot of years. I'm barely holding on to Christianity. I still kind of go to church once in a while. And do I just toss this out? Do I call myself agnostic or atheist? And I don't really want to hurt my parents. They're in their 80s. I know it would be really hard for them. So I'm kind of like, oh, what am I going to do? And this whole, like the Donald Trump thing was interesting to watch too. But I had another done moment.
Okay. Yeah.
And I'll thank the naked pastor for that. And I can't remember his name off the top of my
David
head.
Hayward. Yeah.
Yeah, David Hayward. So thanks to David Hayward. He put it out there, you don't have to communicate, you don't have to declare anything. You don't have to call yourself a Christian or not. You don't have, that's a construct that Christians made. And I don't have to take on that structure. And I was like, oh, done.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to heavily +1 that, right? Like, I think we get way hung up on the labels. I personally am comfortable with the term atheist, but I don't shout that at the rooftops, right? Depending on who I'm talking to, if the subject comes up, I may say I'm a non-believer or, something softer if I want to, or not. You don't owe people anything. You don't have to tell them where you're at.
And you can change from day to day.
That's true. Yeah.
I think I used to love what Rachel Howell says, on the days I still believe.
Yes.
And I'm like, oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Because I still have days where I still want to believe it. And it's so freeing that David kind of gave me just don't worry about that. I had a lot of done moments. So now we had COVID, as I haven't had to go to church, and there's no guilt. But not having to go to church because there's no option to go to church, and realizing that I had guilt about attending church was a lesson for me. And it started helping me understand the experience of what I'll call small t trauma for church. Because I grew up kind of being told I couldn't trust myself. My doubts made me a lesser Christian and a lesser person in that world. I wasn't a strong Christian. And I didn't realize how much I'd internalized some of those things. And I think in not having to go to church and being able to be free from guilt about not going to church, it helped me to explore some of that. And in truth, I was a super strong person to even tell people I had doubts.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And also in looking at the small t trauma, I don't want to compare it to horrible things that happen to people. To me, it's, I had a lot of really good things in my life that were really helpful for me. But it made me have a lot less charity for the goodness of religion. And I'm not saying it's all bad, but I'm so much more aware of how it can hurt people. And I'm much kinder to the people who talk about their religious trauma. I feel like I have just a little small window into it that I didn't fully have before.
I've talked about being the atheist in church for a while after my deconversion. My wife was still attending church, and although I think she will go back someday, so I'm not saying that it's over. But what I was struck by was how you cannot unhear the manipulation. The manipulation becomes just deafening. And even trying to be open-minded is maybe the wrong word, but just, accepting for this is where they are at. It was still very hard because the manipulative nature of the way the language and the music, everything about it just screamed, this is manipulative.
Yeah. And I was aware of that for a long time. Even back in the 80s when I worked at that summer camp, we would sing all kinds of choruses, and they would sing them over and over again. And I remember telling the guy I had to go to Bible study with him, and I said, that's what cults do.
Yes. Yeah, that's true.
And, they stopped singing. He changed the rules. You were only allowed to sing a song twice. You couldn't sing it like 5, 6, 7 times over and over again.
Yeah.
So he did listen to me, which I thought was interesting. But there was a lot of manipulation. And like I said, I think COVID gave me that space to explore some new things. The other thing that happened with Trump and all of this is Trump really took I don't want to talk a lot about him as his own story, but it really impacted my husband's relationship and thoughts about the church. And it happened to a lot of people. But it really pulled the facade away for some around the church. For others, it reinforced it. So it's interesting to watch.
I think that is the thing that is so difficult to communicate is that you can't be neutral about Trump. Either he is horrifying or you find his brand of nationalism attractive, and maybe you're unaware of what that implies or entails. Mm-hmm. But I too have watched, the exodus of people because of Trump. And I think it's because it's impossible to be neutral.
Yeah, it's interesting because the day after he's elected, I actually marched myself to church. I thought church would make me feel better that week.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And it was exactly the opposite. It was a really interesting Sunday because I wanted to go and my husband didn't want to go, which is not the usual. And I left going, we both left going, oh, that wasn't helpful at
all. Yes. We'll get off this topic here in a second, but I just wanted to say, like, again, I've been to, a church that I think is decent, right? It's not horrible. But because they didn't take a stance against the things that Trump was saying, they were taking a stance, right? Whether they knew it or not. And that becomes unacceptable. It's hard to sit and listen to that.
Yeah, and the church that we kind of loosely attend now didn't really take a stance. There is a church in our community that really did take a stance, but I just don't know if I want to do any more church now. So I'm not particularly drawn to any church right now. So this is kind of where I am. I'm a Christian agnostic atheist.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And I love what I said earlier on about Rachel Held Evans on the days I believe, which I don't have a lot of them, but I guess I still have it on some days.
Okay.
Yeah, it's been like I said, that's over 40 years I just talked about. And
Right.
it was definitely harder in the early days when I was so alone in my thoughts. I'm so grateful to have podcasts like yours and other ones that I listen to. You know, any deconstruction story, I am so interested in hearing.
I think that's, why I enjoy having guests like you and my other guests, in that there is such a variety. There's a diversity of experience, both in where we came from, what kind of tradition we came from, but also that there's similarities, but the deconversion process is different for everyone. Everybody's unique, and you wind up in different places. And so your story, I'm sure, Sarah, will speak to people that my story doesn't speak to, and vice versa. And I think that's why it's so important that we do tell our stories.
Yeah, I think so too. And it is good when you hear a story that has some element that you really relate to. It's very affirming, because it can be a really lonely process.
It's that moment of recognition. It's that, yeah, I've done that too, or I think that too.
Yeah. And I think that's what I wrote to you when I wrote the email about it. It was how lonely it was. I'm still looking for my deconstruction friends.
Yeah.
I know they must be around somewhere. And actually, I should say that a couple of years ago, I was visiting, my cousin and I were visiting in the summer, and we don't live geographically close to each other at all.
Okay.
But we both grew up in the same family, and yeah, I'm always trying to figure out where people are on things. So I was asking her some questions, and the next thing I know, we had a long conversation, and she had gone through a big deconstruction experience. She was quite a bit younger than me, but she had also gone through a deconstruction, and we both really connected on it.
Yeah.
Because of our similar family and how difficult it was.
Right.
So it's not like I've never been able to talk to anyone. There's certainly people, but they're always geographically a step away from me. So, and maybe I'm looking for my own church,
Yeah.
of people deconstructed.
I'm in the same boat, and I imagine many of the listeners are as well. I really think that is the next step that, for lack of a better term, the secular community needs to make in providing a safe place to land, some kind of community for people to not feel lonely. And that hasn't happened yet. It's something that I'm constantly thinking about how we can make that happen. There are a few attempts at that, like Sunday Assembly, some ethical societies, things of that nature that are in that vein. The UU Church, the Universalist Church, kind of, it's a little more on the believing side than I'm comfortable with, but like that might be a place to land for people. This is a hard problem. This is definitely, you're not alone in feeling left out.
Yeah. And I think it's hard too to form those. I'm not saying they wouldn't work, but there's a challenge in forming something when you're all just reacting to something rather than joining around something. So it's hard to find those common elements. And as a person, I'm not particularly lonely right now. I have a great system around me. I have a great family. But in terms of that, my experience with this deconstruction, which has been a huge part of my life, it feels very lonely.
Well, I'm working on it.
Well, thank you. And your podcast is helpful, and that's why one of the reasons I reached out to you to tell my story. So.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Yeah, I've been in contact with some people who are talking about similar ideas, and I'm trying to, support those people as well. I'm not a particularly good community organizer myself, and but I'm trying to support those people who are. And, we'll see what happens. Hopefully we'll have more options in the future.
Sounds good.
Before we wrap up, you have mentioned Rachel Held Evans and a few, Mike Mahargu and Naked Pastor, David Hayward. Were there any other people that were particularly useful that you would recommend for people who might be in the process, in the middle of it?
Those are my favorites. So I think I covered who my favorites are. There's a few others here and there. One thing that Rachel Held Evans encouraged me to do was to start listening to more diverse voices.
Mm-hmm.
So I tried to do that. So I follow more people on Twitter now who are more diverse voices.
Yeah.
Austin Channing Brown's book I read, she's a bit more Christian than I am, but I really enjoyed her book and her thoughts. So yeah, and more on Twitter. I try to follow different people on Twitter who don't look exactly like me and didn't come from the same type of place as I came from.
Right.
I think that's really helpful also to understand their perspectives on Christianity, because some communities have experienced Christianity in different ways.
My conversation with Anthony Pinn a few months back, I think, was really important for me personally. That kind of delved into that concept of just, the church has meant something different for the Black community, that you can't just yank that away. And the secular community has not yet provided a safe place to land, or a soft place to land is his term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a lot to that, and I'm starting to understand it more, and I'm not going to pretend I do.
Yeah.
But I'm trying to do my homework in that area too.
Sarah, thank you so much for being on the podcast. I think you have an amazing story. I do think it's going to touch people. That, again, the uniqueness of your story will reach out to some people that I couldn't reach. So, thank you for sharing.
I'm very grateful for the opportunity to share it. It was a helpful process for me to think all the way through it. So, thank you very much as well.
You're very welcome. Final thoughts on the episode. Well, as you can see, Sarah is incredibly intelligent, and you can imagine the frustration of feeling restricted by the roles of women within the church, the complementarianism. I thought it was really interesting. She talked about her and her husband being in these young married groups and always being the two who were interested in egalitarianism. It was really significant, Sarah's example of coming back to the United States and hearing this Christian nationalism as if that was just the norm was utterly shocking to her. I believe she stated that Trumpism and Trump himself was the last straw for her husband. And I imagine, as we've seen with the evangelicals, that is the last straw for thousands and thousands of people. Sarah's deconstructing heroes are Rachel Held Evans, Mike McHargue, and David Hayward. I think those are some pretty fantastic people to check out if you are not familiar with their work. I want to thank Sarah for being on the podcast and sharing her story. I think it's so very important that we have a diversity of people on the show, a diversity of perspectives. I'm very glad that Sarah joined me to give us her perspective. I want to respond a bit to the Christian nationalism story. It is hard to overstate the role of politics in the deconstruction and deconversions of tremendous numbers of people. Even as a Christian, I used to say that separation of church and state is good for the state and good for the church. I actually still believe that, and I think that the mixture of politics into American Christianity has wounded it deeply. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is up for debate. But what I see for the people that I love who are still Christians, who are not Trumpist in their politics, is grief and pain and hurt at what we see on the nightly news. It's important to state here that the word secularism can often be terrifying to people of faith. But really, this is just pluralism, right? It is that we have a marketplace of ideas, and no one idea or ideology gets preferential position. That doesn't always work out in practice. And what we are seeing today, the reaction against the Christian nationalism, is a reaction against American Christianity having a preferential seat. We're then seeing the backlash of those self-same Christians as they experience not the loss of position and power, but rather the experience of other people gaining equality. And that can be terrifying for them. I often say that the politics of the last 6 years or so, it is impossible to be neutral. It is either the worst 6 years we've ever lived through, or you think it has been good for the country. There's kind of very little in between. And it's driven a wedge between family members and loved ones, and even friends. I want to be very clear here because what I'm trying to get across is nuanced. I'm not saying that we should not critique and acknowledge injustice and abuse and gaslighting, and we should not handhold people who are uncomfortable with the people around them gaining equality. That is not what I'm saying. I'm also not asking people who have been historically marginalized to carry this weight. I'm really talking to those of us who have had privilege throughout our lives. It's our responsibility to reach out to those people who we have a relationship with, people who we might be able to change their minds and have those hard conversations. It is also about recognizing the humanity in everyone, regardless of political ideology, economic ideology, religious ideology, national ideology. As soon as we otherize a group, we can hate them. But if we know them as human beings, it's very, very hard to hate. The secular grace thought of the week is we need to have our own embracing of secularism and pluralism. Even our ideas, even my secular ideas, don't hold special place. But I want to be in the marketplace and conveying these ideas because I believe in them and I think they're significant and important. I can only hope to change people's minds if I do so with kindness, care, humility, and love. This is a hard road to follow, and I commend anyone who attempts to do it. I have some amazing conversations coming up, some conversations that really have had a huge impact on me personally. I'm very excited about these. As always, keep listening, and until then, my name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. Time for the footnotes. The beat is called Waves from Mackay Beats. Links will be in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can promote it on your social media. You can subscribe to it in your favorite podcast application, and you can rate and review it on podchaser.com. You can also support the podcast by clicking on the affiliate links for books on gracefulatheist.com. If you have podcast production experience and you would like to participate with the podcast, please get in touch with me. Have you gone through a faith transition and do you need to tell your story? Reach out. If you are a creator or work in the deconstruction, deconversion, or secular humanism spaces and would like to be on the podcast, just ask. If you'd like to financially support the podcast, there's links in the show notes. To find me, you can Google Graceful Atheist, you can Google Deconversion, you can Google Secular Grace, you can send me an email, gracefulatheist@gmail.com, or you can check out the website, gracefulatheist.com. My name is David, and I am trying to be the graceful atheist. Join me and be graceful human beings. This has been the Graceful Atheist Podcast.